Thank you, Andy. I very much appreciate that. But there were a couple parts that weren't in that bio, Andy. And one, I'm very comfortable admitting to all of you. But the second, Andy, I want you to close your ears when I say this. I'm going to share it with everybody else, but Andy, I want you to ignore it. The first part that I'm proud of is that I'm glad it took you 2 years to put this together because this is I get to do this now on my 25th year in the world of elder justice. 25 years of getting to support the professionals who serve older adults who have experienced abuse, neglect, and exploitation. And it is truly amazing to see how far things have come from when I started 25 years ago in this world. And the slideshow at lunch was just incredible and amazing. How I got started was I joined Temple University here in Pennsylvania, and we created something called the Institute on Protective Services. The Institute on Protective Services is still going. I'm no longer involved with it, but it's still going. It's sponsored by our Pennsylvania Department of Aging, and they do incredible work of training and education and supporting the MDTs here in Pennsylvania. But the part that, Andy, I don't want you to listen to right now, but I'm going to share with everybody else, is that when I first started, our original funding, our first 3 years of funding came from the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency. And one of our deliverables as part of that funding was to travel to all 67 counties of Pennsylvania and convince them to start MDTs. Here was the problem. We didn't really know what an MDT was. We didn't know what it looked like, what it was supposed to be. We were kind of like, yeah, let's do what those child people do and let's get lunch together and sit around and talk about stuff because we just had no idea. There was no DOJ summit on this. There were a couple examples nationally of task forces and MDTs, but we didn't have an idea. But we were excited and we were exuberant. We were passionate about the concept. And so we're traveling around all 67 states, but we were also, this is the part I probably shouldn't admit, we were also a bit desperate to get this concept started. So we pretty much call anything an MDT. I mean, Sally, the district attorney, and Bob, the protective service director, could pass each other in the courthouse, and Sally would be like, hey, Bob, how are you? Bob be like, I'm doing good, Sally. Sally would say, Bob, how are things in protective services? Bob would be like, hey, we're busy, but doing pretty good. Sally would say, you need anything from me? Bob would say, nope, I'm good. That was an MDT. We were counting that in MDT and we were putting it on our statistics. And I know that some of you right now are looking cross-eyed at the screen. Maybe Andy is as well. I'm glad he's not on camera. Looking cross-eyed at the screen going, you counted that in MDT? And I assure you, here in Pennsylvania and in no other jurisdiction would we any longer call that an MDT. But there are also some of you from your states that were part of the pioneering process of MDTs that are like, yeah, I think I might have called that an MDT as well. So it is super exciting to see how far we have come over those 25 years and how far we have moved with this concept of MDTs. I have the privilege of getting a few minutes with you to talk about best practices when it comes to communication with older adults. I want to set the stage with that with two thoughts. The first is we want to be very careful as I talk today about not painting too broad a brush. I love the discussion about person-centered care right before this. Because while we're going to talk about general principles and ideas, it doesn't mean that these things are going to apply to everyone just because they meet our statutory definition of an older adult. I turned 53 in like a month, so I'm most likely either 7 or 12 years away from being an older adult in your jurisdiction. But I don't communicate like anyone else. And to take that a step further, unless today, right today, is your 18th birthday, You're an older adult to someone, but you communicate like no one else. You have your own ways, your own preferences, your own abilities, your own ideas. And we want to remember that even though we talk about kind of the broad overview of best practices, these may not apply to the next person that you have a conversation with that meets your statutory definition. I'm fond of saying that when we've interviewed one older adult, we've interviewed one older adult. The second piece, as we talk about things today, is we're not going to talk in terms of specific interviewing styles. So we're not going to talk specifically to forensic interviewing. We're not going to talk specifically to enhanced cognitive interviewing, motivational interviewing, etc. But we're going to talk generally. And this can even apply to conversations and interactions you have outside of interviews that you do for your MDT. You can be at a community event with a table talking about your MDT. And a lot of this is going to apply when you're having those conversations with older adults. A lot of the examples that I'm going to give come from examples either out of my personal life or come from examples out of my professional life that are in the context of those that you serve with MDTs, but they're not specific to any particular interviewing type or style. We are going to discuss a lot about what we should be doing when it comes to interviewing. And we're going to also talk about some of the things that we shouldn't be doing when communicating with older adults. Let me just give you a few examples of some of the things that I see when I watch this video, and there are many more, but I'm just going to give you 4. One of those examples is where right at the beginning, she puts the newspaper in front of Flossie's face, and talk about dehumanizing, right? And a terrible, absolutely terrible way to build rapport. But as we learned from Dr. Ernst earlier today, that could be trauma activating as well. We don't know what happened the last time someone blinded her out. The second thing is there's some talking down, and we call this elder speak, and we'll talk a little bit more about elder speak in just a moment. But there's some talking down, and if you caught it, when the administrator comes in, the reporter changes her tone when talking to the administrator. She's a little less sing-songy to that person. She's a little less kind of in the face. She's more serious. Flossie's interesting here in that Flossie interacts with the reporter. Now, Flossie doesn't say a lot, but Flossie interacts with the reporter except for twice. But what's interesting is when you think about what the reporter did when Flossie remained silent. The first time, the reporter goes, "You sound like a busy lady," and sticks the microphone in Flossie's face. Flossie just sits there and doesn't say anything. Well, guess what? The reporter didn't ask a question, just made a statement. The second time, after she says, "Hey, I'm not looking forward to this party," the reporter tries to use a little humor, I guess, and says, "You'd rather be taking a nap, huh?" Flossie doesn't say anything. And of course, I don't know what Flossie was thinking, but I could see Flossie thinking, well, my mother used to tell me that if I don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. And I don't have anything nice to say about you right now. One that is very interesting to me, and I think is analogous at least to my background and my career and the work that I've done, and maybe it'll resonate with you as well, is the reporter has the flowers and says, "Hey, we've got these flowers and they're in your favorite colors." And she puts them right on Flossie's lap. And Flossie at first appears to say, all right, appears to agree, and then quickly says they're going to fall. And the reporter says, "It's okay, I got you. I'm not going to let them fall. We're good." The analogy, at least to some of the work that I've done and some of the mistakes that I've made over my career, is I've gone in and I've said, "You know what? I've got services for you. They're in your favorite color. They're what you need. And I'm not going to sit them on your lap, but I'm going to sit them in your house. I'm going to put them here. And the older adult may at first go, okay, I agree, but then says something of concern. And I go, no, it's okay. I got you. I can get you meals, home delivered meals. The older adult says, okay, but then says, well, does that mean strangers will come to my house? And I'm like, yeah, but you'll love them. They're super nice people. It'll all be good. It's that ignoring of that self-determination. It's ignoring of that safety concern because I had an agenda, just like the reporter did there. There's a lot more we could do. And I saw that some people were, I think we're chatting a little bit about how disrespectful it was to Flossie. But I'm going to tease you and hopefully keep you to the end of this presentation. Because Talitha, you said I had 3 hours, right? Some of you are checking your agenda right now. But I'm going to keep you to the end of this presentation because we're going to bring Flossie back. And you're going to see a different communication expression from Flossie. And what I'm going to suggest to you when we revisit with Flossie, that what we see differently out of Flossie isn't as much about her, but how people communicate with her. Because the video we're going to watch at the end is from her 110th birthday. It's a different experience, and you're going to see Flossie in a bit of a different light. And I'm convinced it's because how people communicated with her. That's the importance of this topic. There are some unique aspects of communicating with older adults. The first, and this again could be a long list, I'm going to give you 5, but the first is they've got years of making choices. They've got years of self-determination experience. And I love Dr. Mosqueda stole what I wanted to say by sharing that on one of their questions that they have is, are we honoring the preferences or are we honoring the choices of the person as part of their MDT? Because over the 25 years, I've seen a little bit of a shift. We still honor self-determination, but I see more of a shift to reducing risk, getting services in place, prosecution, restoration of assets. And all of those things are important, but there's something called outcome bias when it comes to communication. And outcome bias suggests that what our outcome is will shape the communication that we have with someone. So very importantly, and a unique aspect of working with older adults, and we're going to give you some examples of this in just a moment, they have years of making choices, and we cannot ignore that. We always have to prioritize that. Number 2 is trust over transaction. What the research tells us is that as we age, we tend to want interactions, relationships that are based more on trust than they are on transaction. And I know by the work that all of you do, most, if not all of you, are extremely good at building trusting relationships. But think for a second at another level about the systems that we work in. They're transactional. No, we're not selling products, but we are saying, you give me information, I'll give you services. You give me information, I'll give you support. You give me information, I'll prosecute this case. It's transactional, and the commodity is the information, and our commodity are the things that we can provide. Now, the prosecutors that are here are like, Chris, we need evidence, and you do. And those of you in the health and human services, protective services, advocates, you need information to be able to qualify somebody for services. But what the research suggests when we switch from trust to transaction is that when we go in with communication with older adults just focused on the transaction, we most likely will not get that interview in the same way, or that information in the same way that we would if we focused more on the trust piece first. Brain and sensory changes. I am not a doctor. I don't even play one on television, but I'm going to give you my favorite example of brain changes. One of the things that happens to all of us as we age, or at least the vast majority of us, is our cognitive processing speed starts to slow down. Part of the reason I like this example is because for most of us, it's going to happen in our 30s that our cognitive processing speed starts to slow down. So this is going to be something that affects all of us. And cognitive processing speed affects us in we can't jump from topic to topic quite as quickly as we used to. We can't take complex scenarios and complex information and as quickly as we used to come up with a step, an action step, or digest all that information. And we're going to talk about this in just a moment. But what that says to us is we have to pay attention to our pacing. We have to pay attention to our sentence structure. We have to pay attention to the way we present information because like a lot of brain changes and sensory changes, this isn't about intelligence. It's not about the ability to comprehend. It's about how we as the communicator present the information. Number 4 is a lifetime of resiliency. And I want to introduce you very quickly to two people. The one person is Bob, and the other person, you can just call her Grandma. She'd be okay with that, my grandmother. Bob is a Marine Corps veteran. Bob served as the crew chief on the Air Force One helicopter. He has flown with presidents. He has flown beside presidents. Bob, if you show up here in Palmyra, Pennsylvania at the Rising Sun Bar and Grill on a Friday night, you come tomorrow night, Bob is also going to most likely buy you a shot. But I have known Bob long enough to know that there are things that I can talk about to Bob about, and there are other topics that I can't. It's his form of resiliency. Now there's Grandma Hipschman. And my grandma is fond, if you were to meet Grandma Hipschman, she is 96 currently. She wasn't 96 in this picture, but she's 96 currently. And she will tell you that my grandfather wanted to live to 100, but he quit on the job and died at 75 and left her to finish the task. And she never wanted to live to 100, but she's going to finish it for him. My grandmother is filled with resiliency. She's the survivor of the death of 2 adult children. You can see in this picture that my grandmother didn't have hoarding disorder. The house is relatively clean. But when my grandmother decided to sell the house, I was part of the crew that went in to clean and to sort things. I found a stack of 15 AOL, America Online CDs. You remember those that you used to get for the internet that give you so many hours free? I don't know how many hours that she had. 15 of them unopened, ready to go. Here's the thing. My grandmother and grandfather never owned a computer, but they did come out when they were younger of significant poverty. So part of my grandmother's resiliency was you didn't throw away things that you might need someday. Older adults have a lifetime of resiliency, and we often talk about a strength-based lens. I love the concept also of a resiliency-based lens when we work with people. There's also a shift in goals. And there's a theory called socio-emotional exchange theory. And what that theory says is that as we age, we tend to shift out our goals. Our goals tend to be more about relationship. Goals tend to be more about meaning. Our goals tend not to be as long-term. When my grandmother, late 70s, early 80s, needed to go to a facility for some rehab, I did the pitch, right? I said, Grandma, this is going to help you stay independent as long as possible. She didn't care. It didn't faze her. She was like, I'm not going to rehab. And when we mined down on that, I said, why not? She said, I don't want to miss Christmas this year. I don't want to miss Christmas. There's a shift in goals. And I'm going to give you some examples that come out of multidisciplinary teams where you're going to see some of those shifts in goals for people as we age. We're going to move through these barriers very quickly. And again, we're going to do a session tomorrow. So if you come to that session, we'll spend a little more time on these barriers. But for the sake of this session, I'm going to move through these with just a few examples in each one. One is not making sensory accommodations. We do know, based upon the research, that people 75 years of age and older, about 50% have significant hearing loss. And so we have to ask ourselves in that communication, are we making the proper accommodations to have effective communication with them? The second is not minimizing environmental distractions. For those of you in PS and other fields that go out into the community, you know how tough that this can be. Even if you work in law enforcement and you bring someone to the police station to do an interview, it's a lot of distractions. Or an older adult going to file a protection from abuse order at the courthouse, thinking about those distractions. There's an interesting article that came out a couple years ago that said older adults are disproportionately affected by environmental distractions in the areas of working memory and their ability to pay attention. The next one is not allowing enough time. I am convinced that the enemy of all good things is not having enough time. But as we talked about with our cognitive processing speed, as well as a lot of other factors, we know that when communicating with and working with older adults, we need to allow for more time. I'm also aware, though, that you don't have endless amount of times. So I want us to consider not whether we can give somebody an extra 3 hours, but can we give somebody an extra 3 minutes? Can we go just a little bit slower? Can we pace ourselves just a little bit differently? Minimizing the emotions of a conversation. There is a stigma out there about older adults, and that is that they are emotional and get more emotional as they get older, particularly being grumpy and angry. Many of you will remember the movie many years ago, Grumpy Old Men. And that's not just however long that movie is, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, but even today, there is a viral TikTok star with the handle of Angry Grandma 18. That clearly means that there are 17 other angry grandmas on TikTok. But Angry Grandma 18 has 4.6 million followers. So we sometimes have this perception that older adults are more emotional, but the research doesn't back that up. The research says that older adults have better emotional regulation than younger adults. So we can't minimize or pass over when we're talking to someone and they start to get emotional and go, oh, that's just because of their age. No, it's most likely because of something that is going on as you are talking. Using jargon or complex language, and I know all of you already know this, but let me share the one that I have fallen victim to so many different times. In Pennsylvania, we have our older adult protective services through our great network of area agencies on aging. There are 52 of them sharing or supporting our 67 counties. And of course, what we do, and you probably do it in your area too, about your area agencies on aging, we call them the triple A's, right? We call them the triple A's. And I would love to tell you, I've made this mistake so many times where I've gone to an older adult and said, yeah, we can get you services through the triple A. And they're thinking about the maps that once you opened once, you could never fold back correctly again. They're thinking about an association that's going to support them with roadside service. Now, that's a silly example, but it's one that I've done many times. But using jargon or complex language, and we'll talk about the importance of concrete language here in a moment. Not checking for understanding. There's a lot of support in the research that suggests that a simple yes or no from anybody, but we're talking today about older adults, is not necessarily a great sign that they had true understanding. There's a technique that's considered best practice by the CDC called the teach-back technique. And the teach-back technique is simply where we say to the person, can you tell me in your own words what you heard me say to you today? The interesting part about the evidence around the teach-back technique is it also helps to build trust with the person. Remember, trust, not transaction. So when we don't check for understanding, it can be a barrier to effective communication. Communication based on assumptions and stereotypes. We don't have time to cover all of this today, but thinking through our aging bias, thinking through the stigma that we have towards older adults, making sure that we are aware of our own as well as within the context of MDTs, being willing to challenge those stereotypes that we have. The last one is confusing cognitive changes with the ability to communicate. I've been heavily influenced on this one by the work of Dr. Scott Modell, and particularly his work with people with intellectual disabilities. And what Dr. Modell talks about is that just because somebody's brain may work in a different way than ours, or they may communicate differently, doesn't mean that they can't communicate. And I love the example, hopefully you were all here for it, that Paige shared about the person that they had testify. It was just an incredible example of not confusing cognitive changes with the ability to communicate. I'm a firm believer in that every single person that comes in contact with an MDT that is supported by an MDT has the right to have the opportunity to tell their story. They have the right to have the opportunity to tell their story. Now, sometimes we may be limited in what we can do with that information, but they have the right to share that. So let's go in to some of the tips of what we should be doing. The first is to realize that communicating with older adults, anyone, but older adults for the sake of this afternoon, is an art and not a science. This is a painting by Ray Maholtz, and Ray oversees protective services in Erie County here in Pennsylvania, and it's just a beautiful piece of art. I wasn't going to use Ray's picture. I drew a picture myself, and Talitha said, you know, a 5-year-old could do a better job drawing than you did, Chris. I'm much more, if you remember Bob Ross in the Happy Accidents camp, but I love this image because it paints the art, it paints the beauty of working with people. Not to repeat what was talked about with person-centered, but every person that we interact with is unique. That's what makes this an art and not a science. That's what makes this something that we can't perfect, but we can constantly get better at. Effective interviewing from an art, not a science, requires intuition. One of my favorite expressions that I use all the time, professionally and personally. Talitha says I did not say that. All right, who are you going to believe, Talitha or me? But that I like both professionally and personally is read the room. Read the room. And that's a lot of what intuition is. But one of the fascinating things about intuition is it's not just a gut feeling. That's oftentimes what we think. We think it's a gut feeling, it's some kind of psychic ability to connect and figure it out. The research tells us that intuition can be learned. Intuition is essentially the brain's ability to take in a situation, connect it with situations from the past, and then make a good educated guess about what's going on in that moment. This is just a real quick plug for experiential training when it comes to communication and interviewing. It can't just come from people talking in front of the room. It takes practice. Outcome is often less important than the process. And I am aware that all of you and your MDTs, you have outcomes that you have to hit. And I'm not dismissing that. But I want to emphasize that at the core for me of communication is human connection, especially when those of us working in this area are oftentimes talking with people who have experienced significant social isolation. Our outcome is important, but the process, the relationship being built, that connection is equally as important. Tip number 2 is the ability to identify and connect with a person's meaning. It's very interesting out of the research. And let me admit something to you. This is a late addition to my trainings on interviewing and communication. I really only started to try to incorporate this the last several months. So this is pretty brand new for me. But it is I'm late to the party because it is very backed up by that there is a ton of research out there that suggests as we get older, we tend to engage in the activity of meaning making at greater rates than when we were younger. And meaning making is simply the trying to find meaning, trying to find value, trying to find depth in the situation that we're in what we are experiencing, as well as our actions that we're going to take. I recently had a conversation with someone who had just been scammed. And I know all of you are very familiar with the scams that are out there and how they affect people. And he was talking for about the first half of our conversation about how terrible he felt and how he couldn't believe he was scammed. And in his words, not mine, how dumb he felt. And I did what probably most of us would do. I'm like, no, you're not dumb. This happens to a lot of people. These folks are really good at it. You shouldn't feel ashamed and all that. And it wasn't comforting him whatsoever, my words. And I'd love to tell you that this was intentional on my part, but this happened accidentally. He drove this. About halfway through, he shifted, and he was a prominent member of his community. And he started to talk about the possibility of sharing his story. Sharing his story. And what he said to me is if his story could keep one person from experiencing a scam, that would have meaning to him. That would be important to him. When we look at meaning in communication with older adults, we want to look at that meaningful relationships oftentimes drive disclosure. Because older adults are trying to find meaning in a lot of what they do, even in their communication with you. So we need to listen for meaning, not just information. This picture that you're seeing on your screen right now is my cabin. I'm not there currently because the internet access isn't that great up there, but I spend about 85%, 90% of my time right here. And if you are looking at that and go, that looks socially isolated to me, You're right. It's socially isolated, and I absolutely love it. So if I happen, again, I'm 7 to 12 years away from being eligible to be an older adult in your jurisdiction. If I happen to need support from your MDT, it is certainly a piece of information that my spending most of my time here speaks to social isolation. But if we don't check for meaning, that's all we take with us, right? Remember when I said that my grandmother survived the death of two of her adult children? One of them was my mother. And most of my memories of her are on this front porch or catching grasshoppers in this yard. And so if part of your intervention with me starts to take me away from this, oh, that's going to be tough because of that meaning. I was recently in another state doing some consultation with their victims' compensation folks, and they were talking to me about how difficult it is to get older adults to accept victims' compensation. And we see that across the country that older adults are not using victims' compensation as much. Say to her, I don't want to accept the money because I'm going to take it away from someone else. That was the meaning for them. So paying attention, not just for information, but also for meaning. Using emotionally meaningful questions when we are asking people, what's important to you right now? Or what do you want others to understand about your situation? And there are a few of you that might be like, Chris, you are so a social worker. Like this feels so social worky to me. But the research is really interesting. And it suggests that emotionally focused interviews with older adults improve disclosure rates and reduce defensiveness. I don't care who you are. I don't care if you're a social work type like me, or you're in law enforcement, or you're a prosecutor, you're an advocate. If we can improve rates of disclosure and reduce defensiveness, this doesn't become a soft skill. This becomes a practice that we can use. Next tip is to use best practice communication techniques. These are things that, and there's lots of them out there. I'm going to give you 3 examples, but these are things that we know make a difference in how we communicate with older adults. If you're not familiar, there's a concept of right branching questions versus left branching questions, or right branching statements versus left branching statements. And what we know is that right branching statements enhance clarity. Here's an example. Left branching is if I say anything that is unclear, you can ask me questions. Right branching is you can ask me questions, especially if I say anything that is unclear. Right branching questions put the main thing that we want people to hear first. And there are a lot of reasons for this, but let's go back to cognitive processing speed. Because some of you are like me, and even in an interviewing setting, I sometimes talk way too fast. So I'm going to say something like, if I'm using a left branching question, well, if you know what, if I say anything that is unclear, you can ask me questions. So let me get started with my first question. If somebody's got slower processing speed, they probably have caught if anything's unclear, but now they face a decision. Do they get the main part, or do they jump to catch up with me? Where if I do a right branching question and I make the same mistake, I know that they have heard, you can ask me questions. That's the central point. There's some very fascinating research about the power of right branching questions, right branching statements. The second is to avoid oversimplifying language, which can feel patronizing. We know from the research that our vocabulary continues to increase into our late 60s, sometimes into our early 70s. But then once it hits kind of its peak, it stays relatively stable. So the vocabulary that we have at the age of 65, 70 is the vocabulary that we tend to maintain. So we want to make sure that we don't oversimplify language. And let me give you an example out of my work. I was interviewing someone and we were having a conversation about potential abuse. And we get about halfway through, and I think we're getting kind of to the core. And he looks at me and he goes, "Are you Presbyterian?" And I thought, uh-oh, we've got something going on here with religion. And I go, "No. Are you?" And he goes, "No. I just think P words are the most fun words." And for what seemed like the next 5 to 10 minutes, he just starts rattling off P words: porcupine, Penelope, a pyramid, popsicle. Like he just kept, I can't even do it as fast as he was doing it. And I was like, yeah, you're right. P words are the most fun. So we want to avoid oversimplifying words. If I can go back to the presentation on person-centered, this is where it is extremely important to be person-centered. Because while we know that vocabulary stays about the same, we also know that only about 2/3 of people who could have graduated in 1958 graduated. That means 1/3 of people didn't graduate in 1958. The quick math on that puts those folks in that 84, 85, 86-year-old range. And so we are dealing with a percentage of people that don't have a high school education, that may not, doesn't mean that they don't, but may not have that same level of vocabulary. There's a concept in communication and interviewing that is extremely important, and it's called mirroring. And mirroring happens non-verbally, but mirroring also happens in paying attention to the language that someone is using and then matching that language so that we're not oversimplifying, but we're also not talking over the heads of people, meeting them where they are at. The third one on here is to be concrete and specific. If I were to redo this slide, I would take out especially about next steps. Even though it's a good right branching statement, I would take out especially about next steps. I just think it's a good rule to be concrete and specific, including with next steps. The reason I put it this way is there's some research out there that really shows that the more concrete we are, the better people retain, and also the more people trust the interaction. Trust versus transaction. So being concrete not only helps people to understand and retain, but it also builds trust. But I want us all to think about something, that in the professional context, the only meaning to our words are how they are received by the person that we're talking to. The only meaning to our words is how they are perceived by the person we're talking to. What I forgot to mention to you is I have 4 adult children. And I know which of my children is going to financially exploit me. In fact, I have the report written, and if I move to your jurisdiction, I just need your MDT referral form, and I'm going to send it to you, right? It's ready to go. And while I'm mostly joking about that, and I do understand the words of financial exploitation, but what if I didn't? And what if someone came to me and said, "Chris, have you ever been financially exploited?" I'm probably going to say no. Even knowing the words, I'm probably going to say no. If they say, "Have anybody stolen money from you?" And I'm thinking about one of my children, I'm like, no, I don't think they've stolen money from me. But if we say, has anyone ever taken money from you without asking your permission first? Extremely concrete. And I'm going to say, yeah. And some of you are like, uh-oh, my children are doing the same, right? Because when we put it in those concrete, it has very specific meaning. Making sure that throughout our communication and with our next steps, that we are always concrete in how we are presenting our information. And this is not about intelligence. It's not about the ability. It's about making sure that our meaning matches the meaning in which it is received. The next tip is to demonstrate respect. We'll talk a little bit more if you join the session tomorrow about active listening. And active listening is not a soft skill. Active listening is a research-based communication skill that all of us can do and all of us can practice. And what we know from the research on active listening is people that feel like we are listening to them, that we have demonstrated that active listening, again, it's going to build trust and it's going to build follow through with them. But we want to listen actively without interruption. The thing that's very interesting about active listening and hard for people like me that like to talk about is a lot of active listening is about how we communicate non-verbally, more so than it is about how we communicate verbally. I'll give you a quick little acronym that has evidence behind it. It's called SOLER, SOLER. SOLER stands for sit squarely, for my protective services colleagues that are going into the community and others. There, you may not be sitting all the time. I get it. So sit squarely, stand squarely, open posture, lean forward, slight lean forward, eye contact, and relax. Sit squarely, stand squarely, O for open posture, lean forward, slight lean, E for eye contact, and R for relax. It's something that all of us can do and all of us can practice. And it's been a technique that has been demonstrated to communicate active listening. The next is to avoid condescending tone and body language. This is where we want to talk briefly about the concept of elder speak. You heard it, I believe, a little bit in the reporter's tone. And elder speak, there's several descriptions, but it's kind of that baby talk. Some people describe it as putting yourself in a sing-songy voice. I describe it as anytime we change our tone just because someone is older, right? Not because of what they need or their abilities or how they need us to communicate, but just because they're older, we talk to them in a different way. It's interesting when we look at the research that it is clear that this happens across professional disciplines. And you all can guess at when this gets worse. It gets worse with people with a neurocognitive disorder, dementia. In fact, that there was a study done in Utah about healthcare providers and nurses specifically that found when someone had a diagnosis of dementia, 96.7% of the interactions the nurse had with that person involved some form of elder speak. 96.7%. And I'm not picking on nurses in any way. I think that could be across disciplines. We need to guard against it. And if we see it in our colleagues, be willing to gently call that out with them. Respect decisions shaped by emotional goals. Remember, we talked about socio-emotional exchange theory, that our goals tend to change. I'm going to give you a personal example, and then I'm going to give you an MDT example. And the personal example just happened to me. And this is me at Easter with my two absolutely perfect, beautiful granddaughters, Malin and Mackenzie. I also just want to make sure you're still with me because it's just, I love these two. They're just adorable and cute. And I spent all day Easter with them. But now let me tell you the image source. The image source was my ex-wife. I spent the entire day at her house. She and I are walking around, snapping pictures of each other, and I did get permission to share this story from her with you. If you would have asked me 4 or 5 years ago whether I would be doing this before them, I would have said, I don't think so. And the only condition she gave on me telling this story is I'm supposed to tell you I wouldn't have been invited either. But for both of us, as conditions change in our life, as age changes in our life, we've shifted our goals. Coming away from a silly personal example, I want to share with you an example that happened many years ago here in Pennsylvania out of the work of an MDT. And there were some references, not to this situation, but the creativity that has to come out of multidisciplinary teams. We had an older woman, I believe she was in her late 80s, and her son had financially exploited her significantly, stolen a lot of her money. And the MDT, made up of the Area Agency on Aging and the Protective Services Unit, as well as the district attorney and law enforcement, talked with the woman. And what she said was, I'm not that concerned about my money. I'm just not. And she had some significant health conditions as well. She said, I just need to be able to afford the basics of my care. But what I'm most concerned about is I don't want to die with tension in my relationship with my son. It's not been an easy time. And I can't think of anything worse than me passing on, feeling alienated from my son. So this MDT, now I will tell you, they called the son in, read the Son the Riot Act, and said, basically, you don't start giving some money to your mom. Like, they played a little good cop, bad cop with the son. And they got the son to start some restitution payments. But while the protective services closed the case, while law enforcement decided not to prosecute, the MDT stayed involved. And this MDT started to do supervised visits with the mom and the son. They started to build that relationship back again. A few months later, she would pass on. But I love that creativity. I love that outside the box thinking because they respected her emotional goals that may not make sense for those of us who may be younger and would want our money back or would want a certain form of justice. And I'm not saying we can always do stuff like that, but I love the power of MDTs to think creatively about how to support in a person-centered way the emotional goals of someone. No, we're running a little short on time, and I do want to show you Flossie before I let you go. But we want to reframe resistance as reluctance when we're communicating. One of the things I like most about working with older adults is that they've got 70, 80, 90 years of avoiding questions from people like me. It's not necessarily resistance, it's reluctance. And the reason that those semantics are important is because resistance often represents a wall. Reluctance offers an opportunity. Resistance often represents a wall. Reluctance offers an opportunity. We need to respect, going back to that first thing that was unique about older adults, that older adults have experienced a lifetime of decision making. One of my favorite pictures from the internet is this one. I love this picture, and I am not a smoker. I've never had a cigarette in a day in my life. But when I worked prior to coming to this world in hospital social work, I worked in cardiology. And my physicians would routinely order people smoking cessation courses that were 70, 80, 90 without asking them first. And then if the person didn't do those things, They would label them as resistant. They would label them as non-compliant. We need to have a respect for the fact that older adults have experienced a lifetime of decision making. The second is to understand that reluctance may stem from prior negative experiences. I think all of you know this already, but for my colleagues in protective services, what was the last time an older adult experienced somebody with protective services in their job title? It could have been that they were removed from their parents, right? Or they had a child removed. And it's not just protective services, it's any of the disciplines that are represented here. People have negative interactions with institutions that are going to make them more reluctant to trust the relationship that we are trying to build. The last one here is to use curiosity instead of pressure. If you come to the session tomorrow, we're going to talk about the relationship between curiosity and empathy. It is my strong belief that you cannot practice empathy without curiosity. And I'm going to give you a quick example to this. It comes out of the direct care world. And I know at least most of you don't do direct care like in a facility. Maybe there are a couple that do, but most of you don't. But I think we can all take away from this example the importance of reframing resistance as reluctance and using curiosity. It's a beautiful story of a certified nursing assistant who was working with an older adult in an end-stage memory care unit. And this memory care unit had these big windows. And that older adult would sit all day and stare out those windows. It would get to be 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. The staff would try to get him to go for a bath. And he would be resistant and he would fight with them. He was actually fairly combative, and the staff were particularly frustrated. But this one CNA got curious and said, I think he's a World War II veteran. Called his family and said, what did he do in World War II? He served on a ship in the Navy. And what was his specific role? He was the watchman. He was to watch for enemy planes that were to be attacking the ship. Lives were in his hands. Oh, I'm going to get emotional because this story chokes me up every time. Because of that curiosity, the next time the CNA goes up to him, and we'll just call him John, I don't know his name, but goes, John, you are relieved of your shift today. The next shift is here. John got up immediately and went and took his bath without any issue. And they did that every day after that. Because of curiosity, she was able to reframe resistance as reluctance. And I think even though we don't do direct care like that, we can use that in our work in MDTs to always be thinking creatively about how do we meet someone's needs to help them be less reluctant to what we're offering. Real quickly, and then we're going to get to Flossie. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because some of this has already been covered, but I want you to think about what else is occurring. Is there unspoken trauma? A concept that is relatively new to me, it's been around for a little bit, is the concept of it is not just fight, flight, and freeze, but fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And fawn is where people agree to things to maintain their safety. It's not really that they're agreeing, they're just saying yes because they think that that's what you want and it will maintain safety for them. And so I want to encourage us to not just go, oh, yeah, they're taking all of our recommendations, but always to be aware about how trauma may be affecting a certain situation. Mental health conditions, one of the things that we know from the research is that with older adults, about 66%, 2/3 of older adults with a mental health condition are not receiving the appropriate services and treatment for that mental health condition. So we want to be paying attention to what else is occurring for that person. And lastly, cognitive impairments. And we talked some about that. This is a reality when communicating with older adults. We want to be paying attention to that. And in this, I'm not trying to make you clinicians if you're not a clinician. And I was said in one of the chats that I could see, I also don't want you diagnosing if you're not qualified to do that. But what this can do, and as Dr. Mosqueda and others talked about with their MDTs, is this can alert us to when we may need other expertise to help us with that communication and then with how we're going to support somebody that's receiving our help as an MDT. Those are the tips, and we'll go more into detail tomorrow. If you join me for the workshop, we'll get a little bit more practical. Those are kind of broad views. But as promised, in the last few minutes that I have with you, I want to bring back Flossie, and I have to come off of this screen, so give me 1 second, because we don't want you to have to see the advertisement. And Talitha, if for some reason you are not seeing the YouTube, please jump in. But I want you to watch Flossie again. This is about the same time. I don't know if it's immediately before or immediately after, but this is about the same time as the last news report that you saw. But watch Flossie.
Born 110 years ago, there's not a lot Flossie Dickey hasn't done. And today she knocked another item off of her bucket list. She became Fairchild Air Force Base first ever lifelong honorary airman. A lifelong dream, 110 years in the making.
On behalf of the men and women here at Team Fairchild, I want to make you an honorary airman.
On her 109th birthday, Flossie said she always wanted to join the military. And at 110 years old, she's now become the oldest member of Team Fairchild.
I've seen several dog tags through my life, but I don't know if I've ever seen one that has a date of birth of 18 February 1906.
Base Wing Commander Colonel Brian McDaniel presented Flossie with a set of dog tags and wings.
Oh, I'm well decorated.
Before showing her the ins and outs of a KC-135.
I'm more interested in this big bird than anything.
The spunky 110-year-old didn't miss a beat putting the base's highest leadership in their place.
Well, if I was one of you, why don't you teach me how to drive this thing?
But she would not spill her secrets to a long life.
Never gave advice to anybody. I just thought, let them learn like I did. I had to learn. That's how they'll learn.
Flossie has lived most of her life in the Northwest. She married her husband at 15, and together they had 3 children. Flossie's family now extends to 12 grandchildren, 20 great-grandchildren, and 15 great-great-grandchildren. Though she may not be able to keep track of everyone, she calls them her greatest accomplishments.
So I guess I got along just as well.
A life well lived and a birthday that can't be beat.
Thank you for having me.
We can only wonder what year 111 will bring.
Yes, it's a great day, the greatest day I've ever had.
Reporting in Airway Heights, Katie Curry, KXLY4 News.
Okay. And I saw a comment that snuck in there about what a difference in affect, right? She's smiling in that. And this is what I think is pretty remarkable about these 2 examples. She's not smiling like big teethy smile. She's cracking a grin, right? She didn't suddenly just become, just sharing everything. But did you notice that in the first news report and in this news report, they essentially ask her the same question. What's the secret to a long life? In the first news report, she just says something like, I don't fight it, I just live it. In this one, she gives an explanation as to why she really doesn't give people advice. It's not like a book, but she shares a lot more. And you see the people around her. You see the active listening. You see something called proxemics, which is the study of angle and space and communication. And you see that they're kneeling down, but they're also giving her physical space. They're relating to her. They're laughing with her, not at her. I don't hear any elder speak by anyone in this. I can't prove it, but I believe that what we see out of Flossie is not by accident or is not because she was just having a better day that day. I believe that what we see is because of how people chose to communicate with her. I'm going to leave you with this. Hope you heard it. At the very end, there's this beautiful moment where Flossie says, "This is the greatest day of my life." Flossie doesn't make it to 111. These folks gave her the greatest day of their life. And I'm not naive enough, I'm not social worky enough to say, oh, you can provide the greatest day of somebody's life as an MDT just because of how you communicate. But I will tell you, I think in every one of your MDTs, you can provide some of the most important moments of someone's life, particularly where they are experiencing abuse, neglect, or exploitation, and are looking for people to help support and help them have that resiliency. That is an important calling of all of us. That is the important work of MDTs. That is why I just love seeing how far things have come. So my last thing to you is a challenge. Pay attention to the ways that we communicate. Pay attention to the ways that we talk with older adults, regardless of whether it's a forensic interview, whether it's an APS interview, or it's a conversation at a table at a community event. Because those moments can be incredibly, incredibly important. I know I've finished with like 2 minutes left. My email is here. I would gladly invite any questions that you have. Talitha, if there's one or two questions, maybe we have a minute, but nobody asks questions at the end of the day because everybody's like, okay, let's keep this going. So thank you for all that you do. Please feel free to contact me if you need any resources or support. And for some of you, I hope to see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Chris. As somebody Talitha just wrote, thank you for the profound presentation, and thank you for sharing your 25 years of experience with the rest of us so that we can learn from you. We are done for the day. I'm going to turn it over to Andy to close us out.